Good morning and welcome to the first ever Mill virtual meeting. We truly appreciate your flexibility and willing to adapt to this new way of doing business, at least for a little while longer. I want to give a special shout out to Erica Crow and Andy Ness, who are the technical service providers from Extension Office that are behind the scenes right now, making sure everything runs good. But I especially want to thank our farmers and business partners who are listening in today. It was a unique 2020, but from the agriculture perspective and perspective of the mill, it was a very successful year. Right now, the agronomy teams at Whiteford, Black Horse, and Hampstead are back at the stores, getting all the equipment ready because I don't know, this snow didn't turn out too exciting this morning. We need to have equipment ready to run maybe in just a few weeks. Something I want to give you a heads up on we're going to do today. We're going to have a couple questions pop up that we'd like you to answer. We're going to put one up now, polling questions that we want you to answer. The first one we're going to put up is just a very simple question about, as you can read, how many times have you attended the crop showcase? So you can click on where you want, and then when you're done, hit the end polling. And once that's wrapped up, David Boniface is going to step up and get things kicked off for the talking about our 10th annual showcase. Again, thank you very much for coming.
Thanks for joining us. This was our 10th annual showcase. 10 years, hard to believe. We use the showcase for training, for research, and we get tremendous results for the products that we sell. So usually we give you the showcase results at our midwinter meeting, but there is no midwinter meeting this year due to COVID. So we're doing this meeting for you. First up, the first stop this year was a cover crop, but directly across from that was the forage plot. We planted the forage plot 3 years ago in the fall. We took some of our products that we sell, orchard grass, Timothy, pasture mixes, and we put them in real life situations. We used the same seeding rate that we recommend. We planted it in the fall. Fall's the best time to plant. Second best would be spring. And it's turned out very well. It's been a great teaching tool for the mill staff. We've had tours there, and it's been able to be a hands-on situation. If somebody decides they want a pasture mix, they can stop by and look at it and decide which pasture mix they want for their particular farm. A little bit about the showcase. Again, we seeded it at the normal seeding rates. We fertilized it based on a soil sample results. We also sprayed weeds, used herbicide as needed, 2,4-D and Banville, pretty much products. We also used Prowl. Foxtail crabgrass has been a big issue the last couple of years. And Prowl is a pre-emergent herbicide. We put 2 quarts on in April, 1st of May, and then you have to come back after the first cutting or a month later if it's a pasture situation and put another quart on to get season-long control. The label rate is 3 quarts per season. I want to talk about our pasture mixes real quick. We have 3 different pasture mixes. Each one is unique. We can match it up for your need, whether it's dairy, beef, horses, or goats. Some festoleums in it. I'll get to festoleums in a minute. 4 orchard grasses, 4 top orchard grasses that we sell. They all came up pretty much the same. They all look great, but there's one in particular called Echelon that really stood out to me and to most of the mill staff. It was cleaner and it had less disease in it. Orchard grass does get turf disease and can affect the yield. Next, we put 3 Timothys in. Timothy was was outstanding the first year. Eventually, Timothy started to thin out. And if you go by the plots right now, you're going to see a lot of weeds and a lot of thin spots. I've always said that Timothy should never be in a pasture mix just because it doesn't persist. The Festoliums are fairly new, couple years, 3, 4 years to the mill. Festoliums are a cross between ryegrass and fescue. So you're getting the best of both worlds. You're getting the longevity of the fescue, and you're getting the palatability and the quick germination of the rye. They're doing very well. And then, of course, we have the Martin II ProTech, which is the fescue. And if anybody remembers the Max Q from years ago, we used to sell, the Martin II ProTech has taken that Max Q over. Again, we fertilize based on soil samples. And we actually, the first year, we took cuttings off and weighed and did nutritional values. So that was the first spring that it was established. We are thinking about doing that again. It's kind of hard to do strips and get it right. It took a long time. So some people have asked to see results now that it is established. And we're going to do our best to do that this spring. Again, we come back after each cutting and put some nitrogen on. We've used foliar fertilizers. So it's been a great research tool and a great demonstration plot. I want to thank you for coming to the showcase if you did, and if you haven't, please come in the future because we are going to continue. Thank you.
So we kind of start off, we kind of want to start into the second question just to kind of get you guys used to this. For our next plot, we're going to be talking about cover crops and small grain, double crop soybeans, kind of what that rotation is. So for this question, have you considered planting cover crops following small grain harvest? We'll just give you guys a couple more. So there's some votes already coming in, but we'll give you a couple more seconds to throw out your opinion. So have you considered planting cover crops following small grain, with the majority being I do not plant small grains? I think that would be very representative of our typical grower base and our footprint. But it's good to see, just kind of curiosity, that second one coming in would be no, they haven't considered cover crops because they believe double crop soybeans have a greater ROI. The next thing that we did as far as the showcase that David mentioned, stop one would have been our double crop kind of soybean. Not you. So the first plot that we had was where we had wheat harvest or wheat planted this past spring, harvested that in June, end of June. Actually had really good wheat yields for that field, 118 bushel. But what we wanted to do was kind of look at kind of comparing double crop soybeans versus coming in with a couple different cover crop mixes. And for those, I'll kind of backtrack. For those of you that were able to kind of download that extra PDF that we sent out in that email, this should be page number 3, I think, if you want to grab. It should be page number 3 for you all to be able to follow along. And pretty much kind of what we wanted to do, as in that second answer set, the second most popular answer for that, the polling question we just had was typically people think double crop soybeans have a greater ROI. So we just wanted to kind of analyze, look at that. There's no data from this field. because all we have right now is just the first year where we had planted the double crop beans and harvested, but of course the cover crops are still out there and growing. What we're going to do now this year, 2021, is put some corn in, kind of plant it opposite direction of what we had planted everything else at, and probably do a little bit of fertility trials, just to kind of see what kind of benefit can we get year one out of cover crops and the different mixes, and then kind of put some, not just what did the yield do, but then also add some economic value into it. So this one definitely for this year was more just kind of show and tell, with the plan for 2021 harvest to actually have some real data to kind of bring back. So clicking.
So general info on corn, we planted April the 22nd. It was a cropland number 5340. We planted at 32.5 planting population. We had an in-furrow fertility of 9 gallons of a custom ag liquid mix. Crop protection was our traditional burn down plus residuals, and we came back through to respray. Harvest on October the 21st, and at that point in time, the local granary was at $4.23 per bushel.
And that 423, when we get further into it, grab that packet. That 423 is going to be key to a lot of our slides have kind of a profit ranking, not just agronomic, but kind of some profit rankings too. So that's what all the cornfields and all the plots were based on, that 423 a bushel. Clicker.
So the first one we will reference here would be page 4 in the booklet or the PDF that you downloaded. It is our nitrogen model / timing. For the second year here, we are demoing a new nitrogen model called Field Forecasting Tool from Winfield United. We're kind of putting it up against our tried and true AdaptN, which we've been running successfully for the past 5+ years. There's some differences here with the Field Forecasting Tool versus AdaptN in that this model is predicting yield, where AdaptN is asking for a yield goal. As far as the plot here, we went out in an early V4 timing, which was on the June the 1st. We did our check, which is our traditional 1 pound of nitrogen for 1 bushel of corn that we were shooting for in our yield goal. And we also ran the FFT nitrogen model there. We continued that trend down across the V6 stage where we're usually in the field. And then we did a late V10 stage, which was, I've been waiting on you guys to get here to kind of top dress all my corn at one time, or I forgot about a field, farm, what have you. So, next. Not working.
Doesn't like the clicker.
Nope.
Okay. If I turn it on.
So our yield goal for this field was 220 bushels. We had 2 reps of each plot out there. Pre-plant, we went out with 130 units of nitrogen. All of our N was stabilized in this plot. So as you can see on that early timing, both the model and our traditional 1-to-1 was looking at about 90 units applied. When we got into that middle time frame there, the model called for 15 less units of nitrogen. And then when we got to that really late timing, it was actually dropped at 40 units compared to our original 90 here. Predictions were coming in, as you can see, the early was around 210. The mids were at that 215 to 220, and our lates were around 200 bushel. Surprising fact here of only having 180 units of nitrogen comparing it to that 220. The prediction actually comes from tissue testing that we do that gets inputted into the modeling, as well as imagery throughout the season. So our yields came back kind of surprising, not in that mid timing where we expect our best bang for our buck, but kind of that late timing where we dropped those 40 units of nitrogen. We saw a yield increase there, which kind of caught us off guard. Most of the time when we talk to growers, they say at that point in time, they're not even thinking about putting nitrogen on. It's way too late. Maybe that's because they're looking at putting that full 90 units on compared to that 50 units that we used in this particular study.
Yeah, and I think just one piece to add to that, when you kind of look at that stair step, that mid time frame, so those two kind of middle rows is where we ideally have had our best success with split applied nitrogen. And then when you follow not just the yield prediction column, but then we jump over to what the actual yield was when we trended earlier, those first two rows, you could see that yield kind of dropped off a little bit. And then once we got to that later section, the check rate, even that yield kind of tailed back a little bit there too. I think that late FFT is a little bit of an outlier because it's not very often you're going to always be able to put out less units of nitrogen and gain more yield just in the same split applied scenario. So I think that one might be a little bit of an outlier, but the data is there from what we found this year. So it's hard to kind of defer against that for now.
So at the end of the day, this is what we are looking at as far as our return. One thing I will add is I checked the rain timings after each of these applications, and the June 1st timing, we had rain 3 days after. The 10th was that evening, and then the 24th was about a week till we saw significant rain. So yeah, like I said, the profits there, really good success on that late timing this year, and our bang for our buck is in that middle time frame. So with the nitrogen modeling, we talked about the field forecasting tool in that last slide that we did the plot on this year, but our tried and true Adapt-In we've been using for, as I said before, 5+ years. We've had 70+ field trials slash split trials, and what we have found when analyzing that data, comparing the pounds of nitrogen applied to the bushels of corn that we got back off the field, the grower rates were coming in at about a 1.24 nitrogen use efficiency compared to the model rates is hugging right around that traditional 1 pound of nitrogen per bushel of corn. When you start into looking at a 200 bushel yield goal, that's about 40 units of nitrogen saved that we have seen across these 70+ splits. And at the end of the day, that's an extra $14.50 roughly in your pockets.
Yep, and that's already factoring in the cost of that model as well. So that's everything over and above what was already done to that field.
So moving on here, in 2019, we've been hearing for plenty of years prior to that from university kind of educators that we're not putting enough potassium on our cornfields. So on a whim, we put out two fields. One was 3 replications. One was more of a traditional strip trial. We added a little extra potash at top dress. So that would have been 100 pounds of potash equals out to our 60 units of K that you can see here. And we had 2 completely different results. One was significantly better and one was significantly kind of down. So when we looked at the dollar amounts, you can see there is a very serious gap here. A lot of people last year saw that 103.46 return and said, wow, are you guys going to try to replicate this again next year? And we looked at the minus $144 return, and that being about a $250 difference in the 2 plots, we said, yes, this is something we should really take a look at, because that is a significant difference in, dollar amounts on your return between those 2 particular fields. So in 2020, which will be page number 5 here, we said, let's put out our traditional lab rec that we're getting back from our soil tests based on our bushels of corn that we're looking to grow for that year. And then in our green highlighted sections, we said, all right, let's take our lab rec and let's add for 50% more at our pre-plant timing. In our blue sections, we have our traditional lab rec, and we took that 50% and instead of putting it down before planting, we moved it into that top dress timing. And then we said, what happens if we were to match our pounds of K applied to our pounds of nitrogen applied to that field for this particular year?
So, and then jumping in, this was actually something we saw out in the fields this year. We were out kind of tissue sampling and scouting the one day, and we sent one of our interns, Paul Johnson, out into the fields to kind of pull some tissue samples, and we kind of gave him a heads up, said, hey, if you see anything significant, give us a shout, we'll come down and look at it, assuming that we probably weren't going to really visually see anything, but just on a kind of a hunch. So these two pictures were taken July 22nd. This was after Paul had kind of looked at everything and said, hey, guys, come down and look at this. I think there's something here. The left-hand picture would be from that lab rec where we were just going out based on our soil samples, spreading that potassium based on what the lab was saying that we needed for our yield goal. Where that right-hand picture is where we had matched our pounds of potassium to our pounds of nitrogen that were applied. And that's a pretty significant difference. We'll see that on the next slide as far as the actual pounds that were applied. But just as another kind of key points, this was July 22nd when we took these pictures. That was probably 3 weeks into our really dry spell in July where we weren't having rain. And it was kind of hard to see in the plots when we were out there walking, but I think once we got these pictures back and were able to really sit down and analyze what the differences were, I think is where kind of a couple things started standing out to me first. If you look comparing the left to the right at the amount of sunlight that is hitting the ground, you can see on the left there's a lot more sunlight that's hitting that ground, that's evaporating moisture out, that is kind of drying things out in an already very dry scenario, where on the right-hand side, you have that little smidge of sun right in the beginning, and then other than that, it's pretty well shaded throughout. The other thing that really kind of caught our eyes was when you hear guys talk about pineappling leaves, that's when the leaves are curling up. They're not doing photosynthesis, they're not growing, they're kind of just holding steady, trying to survive. And when you look at that left on how curled those leaves are versus that right, that just kind of shows you two drastic differences. And I think one of the things I started asking questions as to why this was pretty significant, because this wasn't just one random spot in the field. It was pretty well throughout each of those plots, and started doing a little bit of research, just trying to understand what all potassium does in the plant. And from my understanding, one of the simplest ways to talk about it is potassium helps regulate the stomata. And the stomata is on the underside of corn leaves that help regulate respiration. So when there is ample amounts of potassium, the corn plant, like the right-hand picture, the corn is able to, all right, sense it's starting to get dry, we need to close out, we don't need to be respirating as much anymore. Where on the left, on that left-hand side of that lab rec, they weren't able to do that. So they just pretty much released all the moisture that they had in there, and there wasn't any in the ground they could suck up. So I think that's, early on, we thought that might have been pretty indicative as far as what kind of results we were going to see. But I thought that was just a kind of a cool story of what we actually saw out in the fields this year.
So in the trial, our yield goal was 230 bushels. Our soil test results from, I guess, the previous fall were right around 164 parts per million of K. Our pH was right where we really wanted it to be. So based on that 230 yield goal, the lab rec was calling for about 95 units of potassium on that field. So what we did was we had our in furrow, 36 units of K was in the furrow. And then for our pre-plant timing, we went out with the extra 60 units, which gave us 96 units on that lab rec compared to our 95 that it was calling for. So from there, our lab rec plus our 50% at that pre-plant timing, that's where we added the extra 45 units of K in, had nothing at top dress, brought us up to 141 units of K in that particular plot. And then when we have our top dress, our 50% top dress, that's where we took that extra 45, added it in with the nitrogen and sulfate that we were going across with. And then our 1-to-1, we had our 36 in row. We put 150 pounds of K out front, and we top dressed with that extra 45 to give us our 231 to match our nitrogen. What we saw in our yield kind of did not match up what we saw with our pictures originally here. As you can see, that 1-to-1 match didn't quite work out the way we thought it was going to do. But once again, in our middle timings where we added that extra 50%, either at that pre-plant or that top dress timing, gave us a significant yield bump in those replications. As far as that 1-to-1 K to nitrogen, what may or may not have happened, 150 pounds of K at pre-plant timing is a significant slug of potassium on the field. We're starting to wonder, could it have been a salt issue at that timing? Could it have been a chloride at that particular timing? That's a pretty significant amount of product going on at one time. So if we're going to think about maybe trying this again in the future, maybe we need to move all or part of that pre-plant timing to a fall application. That way we have time to delineate some of those salts or that chloride that could potentially be hindering us. That 219, it could have been stunted early and then it's been trying to catch up the whole entire year throughout. So those are just some of the thoughts behind what may or may not have happened on that particular field. Because as you can see from that dollar figure, that is a significant loss of income. But once again, that top dress timing was really well, especially when you returned your dollars. Could it be some fines on the leaves that are getting activated and pulled in almost like a foliar? Could potash actually be breaking down faster than we've been told it breaks down? There's just some very interesting things to look at in that particular timing. Anything?
There is a question, was there any treatment on the potash?
No, potash was just straight potash. So no any kind of special treatment, no stabilizer, no kind of carbon, human fulvic, nothing like that was put on the potash before it was spread. Does that encompass them? Okay. So then kind of jumping into, Joe kind of wrapped up the corn plots from this past year. So now jumping into soybeans, and this is kind of some brief general info on this slide. Page 1 of your packet should have a little bit more detailed list as far as products and rates that were used. But for us this year, we were planted May 14th, all cropland variety. They were group 4.1, 150,000 was our planting population across the majority of the plots. Same 2-pass crop protection program, where this time on our post spray, we actually had a little bit of a foliar plus some insecticide and fungicide as well, where we didn't on the corn fields. Then harvested November 9th. And at that time, soybeans were about 1056. And if we would have had grain bins, we probably would have had a little bit better than that. But that was right around that time. That 1056 was right around that time frame, right when we harvested. So jumping into the first plot that we had down there, which should be page number 6, is what we had titled Decision Ag Solutions Management. So just to kind of frame it up real quick, Decision Ag Solutions would be the new Precision Ag Venture division that the mill launched in 2020. Between myself and Joe, we are heading up that division, trying to take all the different pieces of technology that we have available to offer and try and figure out how we can package them up, cut down on some cost, and really try and help promote some value and kind of give you guys and growers a little bit of help along the way, trying to figure out how we can make things easier, be a little bit more scientific, a little bit more precise with everything that we're doing, all the while being able to take that data and analyze it kind of at the back end to see if what we decided to do really paid off. And a lot of those pieces that we're talking about within that Decision Ag Solutions portfolio, we've done a lot with on corn, but we've really only piecemealed some of those on soybeans. So for this soybean field, we kind of wanted to put it up to the test, kind of throw some different things at it in kind of a stair-step fashion and see what would really come out in the end. So kind of starting with that check block, that would be take a single soil sample, spread the fertilizer, plant the seed, and other than some chemistry, don't touch it till it's time to harvest. The next thing we kind of wanted to bump up to was what we had called the advanced acre. And the advanced acre adds in some satellite imagery. So satellites flying in the sky, we can enroll fields, get some NDVI imagery on your field to kind of measure some crop health and figure out if there's kind of help direct our scouting approach, and then maybe see if there's something nutritional that might be lagging behind, or is it disease, insects, pests. But those are some of the advantages of at least satellite imagery. So we have that, and then we also we're able to take tissue samples off of that. And we're able to apply a foliar application based on those tissue samples. And jumping into that next block, that blue block, we had that same advanced acre satellite imagery, tissue sampling, and foliar, but then we also added a little bit of variable rate fertility in there. So we stair-stepped up from not just one soil sample, but 3 different soil samples to develop our fertility plan. And those soil samples were derived from the Dulum soil sensor. Similar kind of info you get back from Veris, if any of you have had Veris work done in the past. But a Dulum is a sled that gets pulled across the ground and measures electromagnetivity, pretty much trying to figure out the different soil properties and characteristics that are in your field to help kind of remap and define management zones. So that's how we had 3 different zones in this field. So that's how we had our 3 different soil samples, and that's how our fertility was designed. And then kind of jumping up to that elite acre, kind of that top shelf version, we did all the same things as previously. In the last 2, we had satellite imagery, we had tissue sampling, foliar application. There was variable rate fertility involved as well there. And the other kind of 2 pieces that we wanted to stair step into that was adding some variable rate seeding. And that was derived from taking historical yield data. So we have 3 years of historical yield data, soybean yield data on this field. We're able to kind of overlay those all together, aggregate them into kind of zones to figure out, all right, where's our best producing area, where's our average, where's our low. And that's how we're able to kind of define what those seeding rates was kind of aligned with those zones. That's how it was kind of the setup. And kind of looking down through, the really column to pay attention to would be that PP Fert. So that is our pre-plant fertilizer. And in this scenario, all nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur was all the same. So really, we're just going to look at kind of that potassium column here. And looking at that check and the first advanced acre, those first 2 rows, the potassium rate was the same because they were derived from that same soil sample, looking at 80 bushels. 80 bushels was our yield goal, trying to shoot for that field because we know we've hit that in the past. But that's where we were kind of at. And what we then stair step down to, we go from 108 units of potassium up to 132. And that, the only difference there is when we added those, we went from 1 soil sample to 3. So that would be part of that zone management, that variable rate fertility. And then the interesting thing, once you get down to that elite acre, that very bottom, you see that potassium rate is even lower. We actually dropped down to 104 units of potassium that was applied. And that would be based on that historical yield data and those productivity zones that were laid out in that field based on actual historical productivity, what actually was harvested. And kind of to just kind of explain how that works. So rather than just setting that whole field at 80 bushel yield goal, we know that we might be able to average that, but realistically, we're not going to hit that in all areas of the field. The field isn't going to be a solid single color on any kind of yield map. So within those zones, we're able to say, all right, our best producing areas, we need to set at 90 bushel yield goal. Then we're going to drop down, all right, now we're probably at a 70, then we're at a 50 and a 40. So there was definitely a wide swing as far as what our actual historical yield was. So we're able to base our fertility plan off of that. And that's why that potassium rate dropped back down from 132 units down to 104. Then kind of jumping over just to that seeding rate, 150,000 was the planned rate. That was our planning population. We wanted to do a variable rate seeding prescription in the elite acre, but we had a little bit of data conversion issues going from our program trying to convert over to kind of a pounds per acre because we were using a drill rather than a planter this year. So it didn't quite work out for this field, but we were able to get it working for a following field that we'll kind of get to. But for this one, we kind of wanted to scrap that because the data wouldn't really been precise, but at least wanted to kind of show you what just the fertility side would have looked like. So then jumping over into the foliar, you can kind of see that check blocks. Those did not get a foliar, where everything else did get that foliar mix of the Fertirain Enhanced, Liberate Calcium, and the Takeoff LS. So that's kind of the differences there. And when you kind of look at yield, the check block came in right around 63 bushel. Going from that check just to the advanced, there was a 3 bushel gain, where the only difference there was the foliar application. No other management practice was any different there. And then jumping over to that advanced acre, plus adding a little bit of variable rate fertility, where we actually increased our potassium rate as an average. We about got another bushel bump there as well. And then converting that over into dollars and cents on everything that happened. So this is, the profit includes any of the fertility changes, the foliar applications, any kind of prescription-based system of what we would charge for the advanced acre or the elite acre. That one is factored in there as well. So you can see kind of moving up from that check to either the advanced or the advanced with variable rate fertility. There was a positive response there. So then jumping into micronutrients, what we kind of wanted to look at, again, this is another soybean field. This would be page number 7 in your packet. We wanted to kind of look at micronutrients because I think sometimes they're a forgotten piece of the fertility puzzle in soybeans. So as you can see here, we had 4 replications in the field where the check block didn't have any micros applied. The microsync was applied at 10 pounds per acre, and we'll kind of show you what was all in that 10 pounds per acre on the next slide. And then Wolf Tracks, where we had some zinc and boron. So the microsync is, I'll jump to the next one, that'll be easier to explain. So the microsync at that 10 pound per acre rate had 3/4 pound of zinc, a little bit of boron, some sulfur, and calcium. So that is all within that microsync. That is a pelleted product, a granular product that is all homogenized. So within every pellet, within every granule, it each contains the zinc, boron, sulfur, and calcium, which can then be mixed in with your pre-plant fertilizer, with your top dress fertilizer, pretty much any dry that's going out. That is an easy kind of dump in, add in, get your micros. Where the Wolf Tracks would be something that we've used for quite a few years now. It's more of a powder that you kind of dump in. You figure out how much of each you want. I need a little bit of zinc, a little bit of boron, or maybe some other micronutrient. You kind of dump in whichever amount you need for that. So I'm kind of just looking at what those yields and then profit were for both of them. There was a return on both using the microsync and the Wolf Track. So I think that shows that there is a return on using micros, considering them as part of your program. They should not be forgotten about. And of course, even once you factor in the cost of the product, there's still a return there. And I think something that I think Ben has talked about previously is just kind of with the microsync being a newer product that's out, and kind of the thought process, you're going with that set 10 pounds per acre, or maybe 15 or 20, depending on the scenario, kind of split up throughout the year. But just at 10 pounds, you're getting a little bit of everything. You're getting a little bit of zinc, boron, sulfur, calcium, rather than shooting for, my soil sample says I need 1 pound of zinc, but we're only going to put on 3/4. I think it kind of goes back more to kind of getting some complementary nutrients out there. So does the sulfur and calcium also help uptake of zinc and boron or other micros, to just kind of changing the thought process, maybe going back in time a little bit. So rather than just kind of more prescription based, this might actually be trending backwards, at least in the thought, but it's just something to keep an eye on because we did see a response here. Set this up.
So planting date and variable rate seeding was our next plot. That would be on page 8 in your packets. What we did was we really would have liked to seen a lot bigger of a gap in our planning dates, more traditionally towards the end of April and then maybe towards that first week of June timeframe. But we are at the mercy of our gracious hosts. And the first day that the drill could make it to us was on the 14th of May. And on the 27th of May, Zach was calling us to say, hey, we're getting ready to back in the shed because we're done. So those are the 2 planning dates we came up with this year. As far as that earlier timing, which I will call it earlier, but it's not very significant. We did do a little bit of a variable rate seeding, as you can see. Then on that later time frame, we just decided to go out with our straight 150 rate. We put in some check blocks or learning blocks also, where we really kind of jump that population up and then really drop that population to see what kind of effects we could have, and is 110 enough, is 150 enough, or is 190 enough? And where we did those plots was once again in that zone of our really good soybeans, traditionally from our 3 years of aggregation. The yellow section that you will see in the picture is our quote unquote lowest area in this field. And then once you get into that purple, pink, fuchsia, that's where our kind of average middle number was for that particular field.
Yeah, so this picture looks a little complicated, but we'll kind of break it down and kind of step by steps first. But this is kind of just to show this is what this field looked like this year. It wasn't just a traditional strip trial. We had some zones, a little bit of replication set up, just trying to not only showcase what we do, but actually get some good quality data as well. So, and as Joe mentioned, the kind of aggregated that zone analysis, the first thing we're going to look at is that planting date. But what we're going to kind of show you here is the 3 different zones that were set out in this field. So based on aggregated yield analysis using multiple years of yield data, this field sectioned out into 3 different zones. And think about them if you were back in school and you got a grade on your report card. A being the best, B is good, C is kind of that average. And if this was a bigger field or had more variation, we'd probably have some D's, some E's, maybe even an F zone, which is something you probably don't want to see ever, whether it's a report card or in your field. But kind of looking, stair-stepping down, starting at that very top, that green zone, that was our A zone. And historically, we averaged about 75 bushel in there across those last, I guess technically 5 years that had about 3 years of just soybean yield data. Then kind of stair-step down to that B zone where we dropped 10 bushel, and then that C zone where we dropped down even to that 55. Just kind of showing you what those 3 different colors look like. And as far as the planting date was concerned, we just were looking in this A zone, just in that green block. So looking at that earlier time frame, that 14th to the 27th, the 150,000 was our seeding rate in both of them. Those were at least what we were comparing. And as you can see, when we added the yield and then the profit as well, negligible difference. And as Joe alluded to, equipment availability might have handcuffed a little bit as far as the planning date study this year, but it was still good to see that even that week, 2 weeks window wasn't a huge swing, which I think is something we've heard a little bit throughout the year, that maybe early planted soybeans didn't have quite the advantage this year as traditionally they have in the past couple, even though for some guys the 14th may not be early. We're just kind of showing what that may be, what that looks like here in this field. So we're going to jump back to that complicated picture again and kind of look at the variable rate seeding prescription, where in this scenario, even in our different yield zones, the fertility remained constant across the field because we wanted to make sure that the seeding was the only variable that we had to account for in any kind of our analysis at the end of the year. So the first thing we're going to look at would be the orange table on the left, and that corresponds to kind of that orange square that popped up in the picture on the map. So that would be what we had called our learning block in the earlier planted time frame. So that would be that May 14th time frame. That 150,000 was our planned rate for traditionally across the whole field. So that's what we used at that check rate. Then we wanted to kind of compare, all right, what happens if we go all the way up to 190 and what happens if we drop down to 110. And as you can see, looking at the yield and then also the profit, the lowest population at that 110,000 didn't yield the best by about a tenth of a bushel, so not a lot, but that seed cost going from 110 up to 150 or even 190 is pretty significant. So that's why you can see there's a great return in this scenario, planting if we would have planted everything at that 110,000. So then we also replicated the same kind of setup, same seeding rates in that later planted, that May 27th. And as you can see here, very similar scenario. That 150 and 190 did not pay back quite like that 110 did. I think even across all of these, it's pretty much negligible yield difference as far as planting population and how that affected yield. But then, of course, once you factor in the cost of that seed, that's where those differences really become pretty distinct and really kind of show up. The next thing we're going to look at is this bottom table, that blue table, and that encompasses what we're kind of looking at is, so there's a green stripe on the top half of the map that kind of starts on the left-hand side and kind of goes diagonal up to the right. That would have been a manual entry on our side, kind of as a check strip across those B zones and the C zones, that pink and that yellow, where if we look at that table, that B check, so within that green area, we were still planting 150,000, and we were comparing it to our seeding rate applied in the pink zone, which we jumped from 150 up to 170. And then same thing, when we jump out to kind of those yellow zones, we were comparing the 150 as our planned average up to that 185, kind of going a little bit further. And you can kind of see in both those scenarios, it did not pay to increase seeding rate, where we were pretty much negligible yield difference there, and it pretty much comes back to seed cost. And thinking about variable rate seeding with soybeans, this was something that we started thinking about in fall of 19, going into kind of winter of 20, where we had this idea, we had some theories as far as what we should be doing with soybeans and seeding rates, and doing a little bit of research from what we could find. I think it's still fairly limited as far as the data out there on soybean variable rate seeding and the payback, but at least as far as how it's set up, it's pretty much inverse of corn from what we've been able to understand. So think about corn, and if any of you guys have gone out and you say, all right, this is the sweet spot in the field, and I'm going to bump my seeding rate up a little bit because I'm going to get a little bit of a return there, have a better chance to generate yield, which then in turn would generate a return, where maybe in our lower producing areas, our outside rounds or something that gets hit by deer, or any other kind of pests, some low-lying areas that gets drowned out, we may want to pull that seeding rate back in corn. It's actually inverse in soybeans. So in soybeans, I'll kind of start from the bottom and work up in a challenging scenario in parts of your field where you have adverse growing conditions. It's hard to get a stand. Maybe there's animal pressure outside rounds, again, around wheat or around trees, a little bit of shading issue. You typically have about 85 to 90% germ on your bag of seed on soybeans. So in those areas where it may be a little troublesome to establish a stand, do you expect 100% of that 85 to 90% germ to be able to come up and get established? That would probably be pretty unwise to think so, which is why the theory is that you increase seeding rate in those challenging conditions to actually maintain a good stand. Whereas you work your way in the field into better yielding areas, you have a higher percentage chance of getting all that germ, all those seeds germinated up out of the ground and actually being able to produce something to your crop, which is why once we got into our better areas of the field, we kind of cut back on our seeding rate. So that's the theory we've been able to find. Some of the research we found, if someone has something different, I would love to read it because this is still a topic that is very interesting to me and trying to figure out how we handle it. And And I think as part of a take-home message, at least for this field, and what we've been able to find across, whether you look at the orange table, the purple, or the blue, it was those lower seeding rates that generated our greatest return in every scenario. So I think going into next year, we're going to want to consider thinking about even dropping those population rates a little bit more. Kind of instead of 150 being our check, maybe we drop to 130 and kind of see a baseline and do a little bit more analysis and analytics from that side.
What you can see here also is 65 bushels of soybeans and 55 bushels of soybeans. That's really not bad yields on soybeans that we would call our quote unquote worst zones in this field. Obviously 55 would be the worst since it's the lowest one zone in this particular instance, but stepping up those seeding rates just because of it's quote unquote our lowest area in that particular field probably wasn't our wisest choice. That 55 to 65 would probably be where you would want your average. And then if you had some 40s or some 30s, that's where you maybe needed to be increasing that seeding rate. And we should have been essentially dropping our really sweet zone down a little bit to begin with. Because usually in those good growing areas, you get a lot better fertility, maybe better ground. You get a lot more bushing out of the soybeans. You don't need all that extra population.
So in this picture has a lot of colors, but we kind of wanted to ask our next polling question. Before we get into this, just trying to figure out where some of you guys are thinking as far as variable rate seeding. So we'll give you a couple seconds to kind of submit your answers here. Mm-hmm. So the question was, are you experimenting with variable rate seeding? Where it does seem just over the majority says no, but their equipment is set up for it though. Where kind of that second polling answer comes in where yes, corn only. There is someone experimenting with both corn and soybeans. I'd love to get your take on that at some point as well. Where then there's still a couple of you that don't believe that there's value in it, which is fine. We're just kind of trying to figure out where everyone's at least their thought process. So we just kind of showed you our setup from the crop showcase as far as our fields, that little 9-acre field where we had done a little bit of trialing on some variable rate seeding. But we also wanted to kind of show you what we did out on a grower's farm this year as far as setting up soybean variable rate seeding prescriptions. So this map has a lot of colors. And what these colors represent would be that MYYA, multi-year yield analysis. So that would be taking that historical yield data, 3 years of soybean history, and aggregating them all together, kind of stacking them up and figuring out where our best producing areas of the field are versus our lowest. I think there's about 7 different colors in here, where the red would be at the bottom, kind of going to our yellows, our greens, our blues, and where that pinkish purple would be at the top, the highest producing areas of the fields. So this might be a little bit more complex. It's definitely more than our just 3 zones that we had in our field, but 7 still may be a little bit of an extreme. But we kind of just wanted to test it out since this was the first year that we really did any kind of variable rate seeding on soybeans. So, and then jumping over, the first thing we want to explain is the picture of the map at the bottom would be the actual planting population map. where the red colors would be a lower planting population, the yellow would be a little bit higher, and the green would be the highest. And as you can see in kind of each of those segments, there is not a drastic line, but you can kind of make out a line where the majority of half this part of the field is all yellow. That would be the traditional grower rate, where if you see a multicolored areas, that would be our prescription that we were able to put in. And so this is encompassing 101 acres of this soybeans. So kind of working across that top table, the grower's rate was 165,000. That was his planting population. The recommendation that we came up with was a little bit under that at 163,800 seeds per acre. So we did reduce the soybean seeding rate by a little bit, but once you factor in the cost per acre of us to make a prescription and get it out, that actually increased that overall per acre amount, which is why you see it's about 250 or so more an acre there. But once you jump over to yield and you're analyzing it as an overall average, you can see there is a difference there. They're about four and a quarter bushel better. Then of course that 4.25 almost translates straight to profit, just because there was very minimal difference in the seeding cost per acre and the prescription cost per acre. So then once you see kind of down that left-hand side, so this was over again 101 acres, and just kind of showing you kind of the two different scenarios that we were up with. What we had called field 1 was based on our historical yield average, or our multi-year yield analysis. We had a very low, our lowest producing area was about 50 bushel, and our highest producing area was at 80. You can see the respective planting populations that we had set up in there. And then the same thing for that, what we had called field 2, where we had 40 bushel at the low end, 75 at the high, and the planting populations there.
So corn, we did the same thing here. The grower let us come out. We used our multi-year yield analysis once again for 3 years of corn data. If you have more, that is fantastic. And we traditionally still use the 3, but we'll take out maybe an extreme low and an extreme high and average the 3 middles, just in case it was a really good growing year or a really poor growing year. But this particular grower, we had our 3 years. So once again, think about your crayon box. We start at red and we're working our way up to that light pink kind of fuchsia color would be our sweet zones in that particular field. So what we did once again was we split those fields with this particular grower, so we can put ourselves up against him. As far as the seeding, we were slightly higher. Of course, our cost of seeding was slightly higher due to the added prescription fee that we tag on. We also, once again, saw a good return on our yield, a little bit better than his. So we got him a little extra profit per acre. One thing I will say is when we are comparing to figure out all these yields and profits, we are actually comparing his really good zone, say 250 bushel corn, to our really good 250 bushel corn, and vice versa, all the way up through the zones with our yield goals. The way we split these fields was the intention was that he would have just as many good zones as we did and just as many bad zones as we did. So we were really comparing each individual yield goal zone to the other side from that grower standard. As you can see, this is what we would consider field 1 for this particular grower because that's how he has it labeled. We had 2 different locations. As far as the corn seeding script, this would have been one of them, and the other one was slightly up the road. That's why you see the field 1, field 2, but it looks like multiple fields across that particular picture.
So, and just before we kind of jump back through the years, I'll say we kind of wanted to highlight some pieces over kind of the last 6, 8, 10 years that we've kind of seen. We kind of want to show just a little bit of video talking about our Decision Ag Solutions program. Take a couple minutes, you can kind of sit back, and then we'll jump back in.
We at the mill, we started to recognize that technology is becoming more and more of a tool that can be used every day. The new program that we're putting together is called Decision Ag Solutions. And what we're trying to do there is take the data and the tools and everything that we have within our toolbox and create value for the grower.
It's been a long time coming, but I think we have the staff and knowledge to really make changes to a farm and really help them throughout.
So the way we're approaching Decision Ag Solutions is a teamwork between myself and Joe. I'm the boots on the ground in the field.
And I'm kind of the back end, dive deep, get everything in and out of the program. It's been 10 years that we've been working with Ag Studio through map shots, with me playing around with all the tools that it had available. We decided it was time, and we knew the program enough to really start diving in and trying to help our farmers kind of farm, I wouldn't say better because they're already doing a really good job of that, just kind of helping them get over maybe a hump that they have.
There's a couple of connected platforms that we have become very proficient in. My John Deere, of course, we run that a lot. Climate Field View, the Agfinity software, the Raven Slingshot, Ag Studio, and Granular are some of the platforms I think we've been able to easily connect with and kind of share the data back and forth to actually provide some value.
There's no requirements that you have to buy everything from the mill. DAS has been built to be its own separate entity of this company.
We start out with soil sampling. We can work with soil sensors to remap the fields, figure out where our variations are within the fields, kind of work towards some subfield management. Then we can jump into some very bright fertilizer with the split bin capabilities that we have on our dry spreaders. We can go out and variaborate 2 different products at the same time. Right after we fertilize, we can move right into seeding. We can create some variaborate seeding scripts based on whether that's some of the soil sensor data or we jump into kind of some yield management data and reallocate those nutrients and seed to where they're going to give us a better return on our investment. And we jump in, all right, crop's out of the ground, it's growing, let's use some satellite imagery.
Running on corn, beans, wheat, even barley, rye.
Where's our better spots in the field versus where's something that may be lagging behind? Is it insects getting in, weeds, whatever it may be, just a poor stand? And then we get in a little bit further into the year, and then we're talking about nitrogen modeling. So we've split applied already. Split application of nitrogen is crucial. So we've got out some that went out pre-plant. Now we're talking about in season. So we're using 2 different nitrogen models to kind of help validate and do a little bit of predictive science behind how much more nitrogen that crop needs, given the weather pattern, the crop info, the soil info, everything that we've programmed in. And then we get to harvest time. So now we get to really figure out what everything actually did this year. How do our results look? So we can do some data management side. We can help pull that data off, put it into our program, and kind of start deciphering, all right, what hybrid did what was the gain there, or a fertility management, was it a starter versus no starter, some foliar application, what was it?
And also get it through our Tratera Insights engine, where they will give us a scorecard on how sustainable we have been.
And really a data piece is huge. So many of our technologies, equipment, programs, everything is giving us data, and we have the capability to be able to overlay all that and start drawing value out of it rather than just having your yield map printed out sitting in a book that's on the shelf.
We're just out here to help the growers get that ROI that they really want, maybe reallocating some seeds or some nutrients from one zone that's low producing to another zone that's already high producing, but can we really get that producing area to go even higher, which at the end of the line should help your bottom dollar.
Changed on me. So as I said, we kind of want to look back through the years, what we've done over the last 6, 8, 10. I think as we've kind of evolved, 2011 was our first crop showcase event, and just I think back then it was probably more of like a show and tell. rather than actually trying to analyze what was done, trying to set things up to be a little bit more hands-on and actually get some good quality data that comes back at the end that really kind of influences not only our recommendations, but kind of some of the decisions that we make as far as what products we carry, what do we offer, what really has the value. So I think it's kind of good to see where we kind of started, but kind of more or less now I think we're in a much better place now than when we were 10 years ago.
Yeah, I'd say early on we were showcasing products that we had to offer, where now we're kind of transitioning to more of ideas, not necessarily a particular product. Of course, we use our products in all our plots, but it's the idea of what we have going on out there more than the products itself.
Yep, and I know jumping into this first slide, something that's kind of been a bigger push the last 5 years pretty much would be split application. And not only just split application, but also split application with a nitrogen model. So kind of looking down, you can kind of see the years on the left-hand side of that table as far as when each plot was kind of set up, when is the data from, and kind of these first three, what we're looking at is kind of 100% of your nitrogen applied pre-plant versus a split applied rate, where we put about 60% of that total nitrogen need out up front. And then we plan on the remaining 40% to come back at top dress, but using a nitrogen model, we don't always need all that extra 40%, or the remaining 40%, I should say, which is why you see that second column, which would be that rate differences, where 2016, we had a little bit pretty good dry spell during the summer where we actually didn't need as much nitrogen applied. In a top dress split applied scenario, and you can kind of see the yield and the profits there, and kind of jump in 2017, probably a more typical year as far as rainfall and moisture and growing conditions. And then 2018, where rather than cutting our nitrogen rate back using the model based on all the weather and the amount of rainfall that we had over that period of the growing season, we actually had to apply more than what we actually had planned, because that's kind of what the model and the predictive analysis was telling us. So then kind of jumping what we did 2019. So rather than just looking at 100% pre-plant to a split applied rate, we also wanted to kind of stair step in a couple different split applied rates. Where in this table, we're just kind of show the 100% pre-plant, a 50-50 split, and then what happens if we wait till the corn is already out of the ground to put all of our nitrogen out top dress. And there was a couple other splits in there as well, but this is kind of just summarizing what we've seen, just kind of showcasing that split applied nitrogen does pay, and it's something we've been talking about and preaching for quite a few years now. So not only about split applying your nitrogen, but also protecting it, also making sure Mother Nature, no matter what she throws at us, we're trying to protect it, protect that investment, keep it there for the corn, keep it there for that crop to grow. So 2018, we had our nitrogen stabilizer trial where we went out with 160 units of nitrogen applied pre-plant, and that was it. We traditionally had hit probably 220 bushel corn in that field, but we only went out with 160 units of total nitrogen applied pre-plant. And that was to kind of really highlight or kind of show the strengths and weaknesses of the different nitrogen stabilizers that we were putting out this year, kind of really put them to the test. Because if we had put out all 220 units of N in a normal growing year, we probably weren't going to see as big of a difference. So we kind of wanted to starve that corn and really kind of put each of those products through the ringer. And as you can see, kind of stair stepping down from our check to our two competitors, which at that time, one of them was a carbon-based product that was being touted as a nitrogen stabilizer at that time. And the second one would have been a generic Agritane, which the active ingredient is that MBPT, the longest standing, I think, known stabilizer kind of form on the market, up against, at that time, what we had, Nutrisphere HV from Berdesian, and then also Enhance, which is from AgriLiquid, kind of a sulfur product, but has some stabilizing capabilities there too. And not only did we kind of cut back on our nitrogen rate as planned, but 2018, was also our heavy rain year. So that was another good stressor to kind of really kind of showcase what each one is going to protect against. Because you guys shouldn't just be saying, hey, I'm putting a nitrogen stabilizer in, I'm checking the box. You really need to understand what each of those products do, what they're guarding against, to really set yourself up for success.
So Takeoff. It is a nitrogen assimilator. The easiest way for me to explain what a nitrogen assimilator is think of your stomach kind of growling. It tells you that you're hungry, so you go find something to eat. That's essentially what it does to your plant. It tells us it's hungry. If you have enough fertility, it will go down, it'll get those nutrients, pull them up into the plant, and start that photosynthesis process and keep repeating it over and over. If somebody was to come to me and say, I'm putting one of your products on my field this year, which one would you pick? Hands down, 100%, Takeoff is the one.
Doesn't matter the crop.
Does not matter the crop. I think David probably even has put it on his lawn before. In 2017, we had a plot where we were going to run some SRN out over corn, kind of to finish it out. So we said, well, what happens if we were to toss in a pint of Takeoff? At that time was MZ. Saw a good yield bump there from that 198 to 205. Really good return on our investment.
And the SRN is comparable to Coron. For those of you who have used Coron in the past, kind of the foliar nitrogen products. So we were just kind of comparing what happens if we add this product, the Takeoff, in on top of that.
Correct. It is a slow release nitrogen foliar. In 2018, we went out with our traditional foliar mix, but in this particular plot, we left out the Takeoff, and then in another section of the field, we added the Takeoff. So an 11 bushel increase that particular year, which in turn gave us a really good return on our investment. And then 2020 was actual on-farm plot. Grower put it out this year for us, and we had gotten it for him to try on his soybeans, and after he got his soybeans all done, he asked David Shriver over in the Hampstead area, can I put this on my corn? And he said, absolutely. So this particular study was done as a pre-tassel fungicide with the fungicide treatment this particular year, where traditionally we're putting our Takeoff out more at a respray timing when we're going through to put on our Roundup or any of our foliars in that traditional timing. But for 2020, that particular study was done at just before tassel. Once again, here we are on soybeans. 2018, we had our check, and we also had the plot with Takeoff. As you can see, there was a 4 bushel return on that one. And then also in 2018, they have a seed treatment version. So it's a really great product, extremely low use rate, extremely cheap as far as a seed treatment standpoint. The only problem for the mill is we don't have a seed treater. So it is a little bit difficult for us to get the product on the seeds. We do have some avenues that we can work through with certain people that have their treaters to get it on if you're really interested in it. But as you can see there, extremely low use rate of 0.3 of an ounce per unit of soybeans. To put this study out, we put it in the old concrete mixer and went squirt, 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 and dumped it right back in the bags, but I'm not looking to do about 50 units that way. In 2019, we had a plot out where we were kind of quote unquote trying to finish soybeans out. So it was more of a nitrogen test plot. As you can see there, why we have the SRN included in on this particular block here. We also had one other nitrogen product out there, but what we were looking at is we're trying to get 80, 90, 100 bushel beans. Do we need to add that extra nitrogen in? And we had a spot left, and we said, well, let's see what Takeoff does versus kind of our nitrogens. And right there, bang, bang, same yield coming back. But the cost of that product is so, I would call it cheap and readily available, that it gave us a really good return on our dollar.
1 pint per acre is our recommended use on Takeoff LS. And that comes in, call it $5 an acre. Smidge under that, but just call it $5 an acre, and that's an easy investment. to make because you are going to generate a return.
A lot of people love it in soybeans just because you think $5 an acre is usually somewhere around half to 2/3 of a bushel. Now, this year, if you still have beans in the tank, that'd be half to a third of a bushel instead. But once again, 2020, on farm, big test plot, large acres, 6 bushel increase, really significant return on that dollar.
So kind of jumping into a little bit of some humic acid, fulvic acid, and biologicals. Most of these studies over the last couple of years were done as more of an in-furrow placement, but we did have one as a foliar. So kind of just starting at the very beginning, the very top, just looking at kind of an in-furrow application, adding a carbon, adding a fulvic and humic acid product in furrow at this rate was 2 quarts per acre, and kind of the return that came back there. And just as a kind of an idea, the check in this scenario wasn't no starter. There was a base starter in both of those, and the carbon was just added into that second piece. Then kind of jumping, not in furrow, but we're moving to a foliar, where C15. So C15 was an experimental product from AgriLiquid, which is now marketed as C-Tech. But at that time with C15, it was just the fulvic acid piece. There was no biological, so just applied as a foliar on soybeans, the kind of response we were getting there. And then jumping down 2019, when we're kind of looking at, all right, back to in furrow again, where we're comparing a check rate versus a C-Tech, that C-Tech product I was talking about, which is a fulvic acid plus biologicals that are in it at 1 quart per acre, and then also back to just the fulvic and humic acid comparison. Just kind of the response you get out of both of those, regardless which product or which company it was coming from. And then looking down at the very bottom, just kind of comparing just biologicals to a fulvic acid plus biologicals. So at least from what we can see in our work, it's not just biologicals doing some of this. It's probably more in that fulvic acid, humic acid combination, or a combination of the two. But definitely just something to kind of think about as far as adding something to your starter in furrow, or thinking about as more kind of like a foliar application as well. So sulfur on soybeans. We're going to throw up our last polling question of the day, kind of before we get into this, just to kind of get a baseline on where everyone's at currently with their soybean management. So the question would be, for a soybean crop, how many units of sulfur are you applying during the season? So as an average, how much are you putting down, whether it's pre-plant, whether it's a foliar application, whatever it may be, where do you think that you fall? Very decent. Yep. So for soybean crop, how many units of sulfur are you applying during the season? Where half of you that responded are somewhere in that 5 to 12 units range, where that second leading one was either split at either none, or that 21 plus. So that's just kind of good to see. Exit out. So sulfur on soybeans is kind of set up. We did a 2-year study. The first year, looking at 2018, those first 2 rows. So we had a check rate of no sulfur applied versus ammonium sulfate. And these results are kind of bunched together, averaged together. We had 2 different plots, one at 50 pounds and one at 85 pounds per acre applied pre. We did have a yield response, a good yield response, 5 bushels there. And of course, even factoring in the cost of the product. So applied pre-plant, it's already mixed in. You don't need to make a special trip for it. That still came back as a return there. We also, in 2018, we did have a liquid kind of a sulfur product with a little bit of nitrogen that was sprayed down pre-plant with our burn down with our herbicides. Those neither rate, I think it was a 10-gallon and 20-gallon rate. Neither of those provided a return. I think one of them might have had like a little bit of a gain, but once you factor in the cost of that product, it did not pay. So kind of what we wanted to look at then, jumping to 2019, we wanted to take that study and then kind of expand it out a little bit, take what success we did have on those products and then kind of expand it out in a couple of different scenarios. So again, 2019, we had our check rate, our ammonium sulfate. We actually increased rates a little bit, where the low end, we were at 65 pounds and our higher end plots, we were at 100 pounds. And each of those rates, the low and the high, we applied at pre-plant. And then we also said, all right, what happens if we come back in and top dress right about R1? Not a very typical scenario, not a very typical application that's made, but with us, we get the flexibility to kind of be able to try things and really see what happens. And then we said, all right, well, we're going to come in and top dress some ammonium sulfate. So we do have this sulfur product that's foliar available. What happens if we go in during that fungicide, insecticide timing, right about that R2, and we're already going in, so let's add a little bit of this foliar sulfur product in there. And regardless of, in both years, regardless of the rate of ammonium sulfate or that foliar sulfur product called Enhance, regardless of rate or timing, there was a positive yield response. And I think just looking at 2019, the two most economical choices is either add some ammonium sulfate in pre-plant with whether it's your MAP or your potash that you're spreading, or wait till kind of that respray time, whether it's herbicide, kind of respray, or you're waiting to that foliar. And I think just sulfur in general, just that thought process of spreading it more and more on soybeans is probably in part because we don't have as much acid rain, we don't have as much free sulfur coming out of the air. Some of those Clean Air Acts have cleaned up some of those plants. And I know there's quite a few meetings we go to where they kind of show that reduction in kind of more of a map form, so you can kind of see visually where it's all coming from and how we're not getting as much out anymore. So it's kind of good to see we're kind of making up for that now, being able to get some product out there to kind of help gain a little bit more yield and a little bit more return. So then here would be kind of back 2011. So our first year of Crop Showcase, we were actually over at David Tracy's Gunpowder Game Farm. And both these studies, both years, were done by Ron Mulford. So thank you to him for being able to get this out and the info he was able to share with us. But we were looking at a product called More Than Manure, which is now branded as Pit Pro. So that would be taking a product that is able to help stabilize nitrogen and phosphorus in manure situations. So looking just at the first year we did it, 2011, we were looking at using layer manure. 2.5 tons per acre was our applied rate. So we had our checkout, which had no manure, no additional nitrogen, and then we kind of went down to, all right, let's surface apply this 2.5 tons and just surface apply it, that's it. Then we went, all right, next block, what happens if we take that same 2.5, we're going to incorporate it, kind of work it down in the ground. That's how some guys say you're supposed to help protect it, help keep all that there. And then, all right, what happens if that bottom one, we add More Than Manure, and that was added after the manure was spread. We went right back in with a sprayer and sprayed the More Than Manure over the top. So it is a liquid that can be tank mixed, or in this scenario, it had to be tank mixed because it's dry manure. There was no pit. There was no kind of lagoon that we could dump it in to kind of get it mixing first. So we had to kind of spray it on after. And just kind of seeing some alternatives to tillage. How can we kind of still maintain that no-till scenario that a lot of guys are doing, and the benefits that provides, but also keeping that nitrogen and that phosphorus available and protected for those crops. And then we kind of replicated that same study in 2014, where instead of layer manure, we're now in broiler manure. 2.5 ton rate was that same, and we still have that surface applied left on top. Then we have that incorporated, and then we said, all right, what happens? Same thing again. Let's spread the broiler manure, then come back in and spray More Than Manure over top. So just kind of good to see that both those years that it was done, there was very much an advantage of adding that more than manure over any kind of tillage or incorporation.
So split application equipment. In 2017, we got to demo a Heggie sprayer that was in the neighborhood with the Y-Drop drop tube technology. For anybody not familiar with Y-Drops, it is a drop tube, but there's a whole unit that goes down in between the rows, and then it has two hoses coming off that kind of form a Y that run directly along the edge of a corn plant. So it is literally dropping your nutrition right at the sides of every stalk going down the row. And we said, well, let's put that up against our traditional dry spun on fertilizer that we've been doing for, at that point in time, probably 7 to 8 years. And then of course, we did a foliar test out there as well with the SRN. What we take away from this is not necessarily that we did better than the Y-Drop, because any way of getting your nitrogen split applied is a win in our book, but that we were doing just as good of a job as the latest and greatest drop tube on the market.
Or better.
Or better. In about 2017, maybe 2016, we were in Louisville, Kentucky for the National Farm Machinery Show, and I saw this thing for the first time, and I stepped it off at about 17 to 17 and a half feet and said, where in the world am I going to get this thing up and down the road? So with our dry fertilizer, at least we're doing as good, if not better, than the latest, greatest drop tube on the market.
Yeah, it was good to see. I mean, we're not married into any kind of dry fertilizer equipment company. We have no stock in them. If the Y-Drop would have came back and outperformed significantly or generated any kind of return, we really would have started looking at that heavier and seeing if that's something we need to make as a company, that kind of switch that we need to make. So it was good to see that we are still doing in this scenario and this year, what we are currently offering and recommending is the best of the best right now.
So as far as corn pop-up starter or study here, 2014, 2015, we did a couple of traditional corn pop-up. In 2014, we had our check rate of absolutely zero pop-up starter. And then we also had our mill mix that we derived from our soil test that we take every year. So it was a PK plus micro mixture at 5.5 gallons per acre, and saw a 16 bushel yield boost there. And then in 2015, at the time, 1034.0 was very predominant still in our area. So we took that 1034.0, put it out at 5 gallons per acre in the furrow. And then we took our mill mix, which is ag liquid products, and we made an equivalent of a 1034.0 to kind of put it up against that old tried and true poly at 5 gallons also to the acre, and saw a really significant yield bump there of about 28-ish bushels. And then we also put out our mill mix at that point in time of our PKS plus micros from our soil test, and saw even more of a return in that general area. Since then, of course, we've been continuing on with that PKS micros, whatever it may be, from our soil tests that we pull every year to custom mix our fertilizer for the showcase. So fall residue. In 2014, we started looking at fall residue applications in the fall after corn has been harvested. For this particular plot, it would have been corn on corn. So in 2014, we went out. In our check, we did absolutely nothing too. We just ready mowed, left the fodder out there to do its natural thing. In a plot strip trial, we put out 2 quarts of carbon with water. In another strip trial, we put out 30% UAN at 5 gallons per acre. And then we combined the two in our last strip trial. And as you can see, as we started kind of adding the products, we kind of started stair-stepping up until we got to that UAN plus the carbon at that 183 bushel to kind of help start breaking down all this corn fodder that we're having from all these new hybrids and all these really good yields that we've been seeing the past couple of years. This fall, I got to the showcase a little bit late to harvest soybeans, so Tim was riding in the combine. So I started walking the fields, kind of seeing how many beans we had coming out the back and how well the combine was essentially harvesting them at the time. And I started noticing that there wasn't a whole lot of corn fodder left over from last year's really, really, really good corn yields that we saw down there. Some areas of the fields were hitting 300 bushels, so you know there was a lot of residue from that corn plant. And I wasn't seeing a whole lot left out there, maybe a couple cobs here and there that are usually the last ones to break down. And I thought to myself, what did we do differently last year that we normally don't do? And with that C15 that we saw on our previous slides, we still had some in a tote on the shelf, and we were trying to just get it out of the warehouse at this point in time because it had been labeled as C-Tech for a couple years then. And we put a quart out last fall on all of our corn ground. And after seeing those results, we decided that we needed to come out and try this fall residue application test again. So we fired up the sprayer. We put in a quart of C-Tech now and put it on 3 replications across a field. And then we have 3 replications of nothing. And then we also have 3 replications of a new product to us called Bio 800. It's from a company that we sell some of our products to. They've seen really good success in wheat in the Midwest right now, and they wanted us to try some here. So we thought biologicals and carbon, this might be a perfect fit for a fall residue situation also. Part of the reason that we want to look at this again was, I mean, we obviously saw a significant yield bump, but a lot of people are starting to go back towards some fall tillage to get some of these stalks broken down into the ground. I've personally been a part of walking my grandfather's field and finding corn residue from 3 or 4 seasons ago still down in the ground. So if we can help get that broken down without having to disturb that soil in a no-till situation, we're going to release those nutrients back into the ground for either next year's crop or the year after. And if we can really get some breakdown here over the winter, early fall, maybe it's easier to get the soybean crop in the ground for next year because you're not trying to cut through a lot of fodder. Anything, Ned?
So, and in the chat feature within the Zoom, we're going to post a link to a JOT form, and that JOT form is going to be a survey. And there's kind of just a couple key questions. It won't take you very long. We just asked, is first going to ask, how do you rate today's session? Be honest with us. We need to know. So we need to know if we need to change anything or kind of see how we're going to kind of measure ourselves.
Do the ewes come in with baby lambs or no? This is everything?
So then after you rate us, you can kind of tell us if you like the virtual setting or would prefer in person. Then kind of the last 2 points is what we really want to kind of key in on is, was there anything you saw that we talked about today that you maybe want to experiment on your farm with this year, this coming year? We are more than happy to kind of figure out how we can set those up, try and figure out how we can kind of show some value in some of that and use our data analytics from the Decision Ag Solutions side and really kind of learn something as we go. And then that very last piece is going to be, what do you think we should do this year? We haven't planted anything yet in any of the fields or the plots, so there's still time. We are always asking for any kind of ideas that you guys may have, want us to trial. Rather than you doing it on your farm, let us try it out. And if we fail, we fail. If not, great. So just take a couple minutes and fill that out if you can find that in the chat section. And then I think Ben is going to come up and kind of close us out for the day then.
Thank you.
Tim, Joe, David Boniface, of course, Erica and Andy behind the scenes. Thank you for helping us pull this off. For you out there listening and participating, thank you for the questions. There were several private questions sent in. I guess that's the shy farmers that didn't want their questions maybe shouted out. But again, we appreciate you taking a minute. We're going to leave the link up a little bit so that you can fill that out. We need your feedback, and we truly appreciate the trust that you place in us each year. Thank you.
Yeah, and just to comment on that questions, if you do have questions, we'll stay open for a couple more minutes yet. So if you do, feel free to type them in. We'll either type back to you if it's something simple or if we think it's something needs shared. We will absolutely just kind of unmute ourselves and share that answer as well. So thank you again.